about this, the clustering methodology. And we talked about a few clustering methods, and then we talked about some k-means and hierarchical clustering. And then finally, we talked about one additional methodology, something called a Gaussian mixture model. And we went a little bit fast last time, so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes to kind of review what we talked about on the Gaussian mixture models of that. So this is the model developed for the unsupervised learning, and primarily for the purpose, actually, from the point of view of constructing a probability distribution estimation. So the idea is that suppose you have sets of data sets here, and with the samples distributed look something like this one's here. And for this type of data sets here, probably you can still see that there are two different groups of data you can see from these data sets here. However, it is not clear how to completely separate them into two distinct clusters. And so you can imagine if you apply k-means or hierarchical clustering, so those type of methodology may not work well for this type of ones here, because in terms of location-wise, they do not separate very well. So more or less the patterns here, or the clustering property are kind of reflected in terms of the distributions of the data sets. And for that purpose here, we think about saying, well, let's model the distributions of this data sets here. And for instance, for this one here, we might think about we can use Gaussian distribution to model this type of data sets. And however, we learned from the Gaussian distribution. The Gaussian distribution usually is kind of bell-shaped distributions. You have one mode, right, center at the mean, and then with the standard deviation or covariance that's spread out from the distributions of that. And for this particular data sets here, and you can see that one Gaussian will not fit very well on this data sets here, because you have kind of two modes of distributions. So one single Gaussian will not fit well. So that motivated us to say, well, let's, instead of using one Gaussian, let's use multiple Gaussian to model that distributions. So this is very clear in a one-dimensional space. Suppose in a one-dimensional space here, and for this type of data sets here, you can see that they don't cluster and coalesce around a single mode, but instead of multiple modes. So in that case, people say, well, let's say they use 3 Gaussian to model this distribution. And then we just need to say, the overall density function is a mixture of these 3 Gaussian distributions, and with some weight parameter, pi c, associated with each one of them. So now, in this case here, you can model this distribution with this kind of very irregular shapes here, multi-mode distributions. And that makes your kind of the models here much more flexible than the single Gaussian distributions. However, it came as more parameters that you will need to estimate from the data sets here. For single Gaussian, we only have mean and variance. And we say that you can estimate mean and variance based on empirical mean and empirical variance. So that is the case if you have only one single Gaussian to model the distribution. So in the case you have multiple Gaussian distributions, so now you have multiple mu, multiple covariance, standard deviations here. And how to estimate these parameters now becomes harder than the previous single Gaussian models. And the question in this case here, well, if you view them as a model here, that's okay. I have just more parameters associated with these models here. And then the next question, is how to estimate the parameters from this sample data sets here. And then we say what you can do, you can construct a loss function. So loss function would be similar, you can construct based on the log likelihood. And essentially you say for each one of the data sets here, I can calculate this px here. So this will be the likelihood. I just plug into this formula. And then I'm going to take a calculate likelihood for all the data sets here, and then take a product between them. Or alternatively, I can take log likelihood, take log of p here, and then sum the log likelihood. And then so that would be the log likelihood of your entire data sets here. And if you want to formulate a loss function, you negate that. Say take a negative log likelihood. So now you have an overall loss function. And the next set of questions is this: how do I optimize this? How do I minimize this negative local likelihood with respect to these parameters? And hopefully, by solving this optimization problem, I will be able to estimate the parameters associated with this multi-mixture of Gaussian distributions. And then we kind of, I mentioned one specific methodology called the EM algorithm for exactly solving these problems here. And some of you ask, why not using gradient descent? Well, you could use gradient descent algorithm to estimate the parameters. And however, in general, the gradient descent does not work so well for this type of models here. You could, but doesn't work so well. So instead, people use this type of algorithm called expectation maximization algorithm for solving these estimate these parameters. And you can think about it something very similar to the k-means algorithm. So in the k-means algorithm, we have two steps. One step is so-called membership assignment. Essentially, given a set of clusters here, I need to put data associated with each one of the clusters. And so in this case here, in the mixture of Gaussian case here, you can think about each Gaussian is associated with one cluster. And suppose I use k Gaussians to model this distribution. Essentially, I have k clusters by assumption. And then, so in the expectation step, and what we want to know is, we want to estimate the association of each data sample to one of these k clusters, one of the Gaussian distributions of that. And however, this different from the k-means clustering algorithm, in this EM algorithm here, we actually calculate a soft assignment. What I mean here is we calculate a probability distributions of assign that data set to each one of the k clusters of that. So they are not going to be 0 or 1 as in the case of k-means algorithm, but instead is a kind of a continuous score. So that is R sub IC we calculate respect here. And then how do we calculate RIC is related to the proportions of the normal distribution associated with the C centers. And then this is likely how good is this fit to this particular Gaussian distribution of that. So that would be proportional to that, and then we normalize by a constant to derive a probability distribution among k different centers of that. So that is this first step of so-called expectation steps of that. And the next step is this maximization step. So that step essentially is to update the parameters associated with each Gaussian distribution of that. So that is very similar to the second step of the k-means clustering algorithm. So in that case, we are updating the centers of each cluster. So here is very similar. We update the mean parameter associated with each normal distribution. You can think of the mean as the center of the clusters of that. And that is the MC here. That will be not MC here, mu C here. So that will be also the average of each data samples here. However, the data sample is weighted by this membership assignment variable, RIC here. And because in this case here, we do not have a hard assignment, we weight them by this parameter. So in the k-means algorithm, we do have a hard assignment. We simply take an average of the data that has been associated with that cluster. So that is the difference between the two. And then the second thing that's different is in this case, in the Gaussian mixture model, we also estimate a covariance matrix. So that is different from the k-means algorithm. So in the k-means clustering, covariance matrix essentially is assumed to be a constant, to be identity matrix. And in the Gaussian mixture model, we make it more flexible. We estimate covariance matrix. And then we iterate between these two steps. So that's the so-called EM algorithm for estimating the parameters of the Gaussian mixture models here. So I showed you one example last time here. Suppose this is the data sets here. We want to kind of put data into different groups. And of course, you can think about applying k-means clustering on these data sets here. But you imagine that it's not so easy because there's no clear separation between those different sets of data sets here. So instead, we can think about applying a Gaussian mixture model on these data sets. So we start with the random initializations of the center and a random covariance matrix associated with each one of the clusters here. And suppose we're going to use two Gaussians to model this data sets here. So now we randomly initialize two centers and two covariance matrix. So covariance matrix, you can think about what it will be the shape of the ellipsoid here. And so that initially that will be in this shape. So now I'm going to update them by following this EM algorithm. So now we're going to update this center and covariance matrix. And after a few iterations here, you can see now converge to two different Gaussians here. And these are the Gaussians associated with the data set on this side here. These are the Gaussians associated with the data sets here. So you can see in this case here, not only centers are separate, right, but also the shape of the distribution are different as well. So that will be reflected in the covariance matrices estimated for each one of the Gaussian distributions of that. And also you notice that those two Gaussian distributions does not completely separate, right? So there's a boundary such that these data sets here can be associated with the green Gaussian, can be associated with the red Gaussians. For that purpose, this data sets here, the membership assignment will be, somewhat very fuzzy. You can imagine that will be have 50% chance associated with the green cluster, 50% associated with the red cluster. So that is kind of an advantage of these Gaussian mixture models that provide you a soft assignment for this one here. So let me show you a demo here. So this demo will show you in the performance of the Gaussian mixture model. So this will be an illustration of the two-dimensional data sets here. And these are the initial data I have on this side here. So, so you can imagine, you have, you might say there are three clusters here, right? If you use k-means clustering, you might derive three clusters. However, you could argue that I might have one additional set of data sets here on this side here that would be different from the rest of them here. And for that purpose, let's say, suppose I have 4 clusters and I'm going to fit with the Gaussian distribution, what will look like here. So let's do that. So let's say I'm going to do random initialized cluster. So initial random cluster here will be random center, random covariance matrix associated with 4 different Gaussians here. So that will be plotted here. And then I'm going to run EM iterations. So this is the first iteration now. You can see this somewhat associated with this blue group of data sets here, purple, red, green here. And let's see, keep running. So now what you can see is start to emerge, right? So you have this blue cluster here, and then the purple ones here. And right now, purple ones here still is kind of elongated here. And this is a green and red, they're overlapping with each other. And now if I keep running, and then you can see what shrink, the covariance matrix become more compact here. And in this case. So now algorithms start to converge now. You have pretty tight distribution. Describe this set of red dots here, is a green here. So however, these two clusters are overlapping with each other. So they are distinct only in the fact that their underlying normal distributions are different. But the data itself, in terms of location-wise, they are overlapping with each other. So you will not be able to separate them based on k-means algorithm. However, if you use a Gaussian mixture model, you can capture the property much better than this one's here. So that's the Gaussian mixture model. In general, the Gaussian mixture model, the reason I want to talk about it here is because the approach here is very generic, very general. If I go back to talk about the Gaussian mixture models here, so this is a fundamental idea behind many of these probabilistic models in the field of unsupervised learning. So in this case here, what I mentioned last time here, so the unsupervised learning is hard because part of the challenge is how do you formulate the problem? So and what do you mean the patterns within the data sets? Because it's not very rigorously defined. So so one of the approaches that people have been proposed over the years is to say, well, let's try to estimate the distributions of the data sets here. Try to identify a model to describe probability distributions of data sets. Because if you can do that, and then provide you a good description of data sets here, and you can also generate random samples of data sets here, and you generate fake samples. And then because the distribution itself tells you relationship between different variables and what is the density of distribution, where they're located, right? So that provides you lots of information. So this is one of the In many cases, one of the principal approaches in the field of unsupervised learning is try to estimate the distribution on the samples. So if you formulate it unsupervised learning this way, and then there are a lot of approaches you can think about, right? So in this case here, you think about it, it's kind of a parametric way to describe the distributions of X. And because I know single Gaussian will not model the data very well, and I said, well, let's use multiple Gaussian, mix them together. So now I expand the space of the parameters of multiple sets of parameters I need to estimate. So in the end, I will try to estimate these parameters from the data sets here by maximizing the likelihood. And by doing that, you can formulate this problem into a kind of framework we talked about previously. That would be the optimization framework. So that way you can think about it, you can have a more principled approach to address these type of unsupervised learning problems there. So you can imagine you can change this problem in various different ways. For instance, you do not need to use a normal distribution, but you can use something else. Some other distribution fit the data you are considering, there is more specialized distribution, you think that will fit better, and then you can use that. So there's a lot of room for improvement within this type of framework. So in general, it's kind of useful. So unfortunately, in this class here, we're kind of very limited in scope here, so we'll not have time to go deep into this side of that. But if you want to learn more about this type of thing, so in the machine learning field, there's something called probabilistic models. Or in particular, there's an even more specific field, something called probabilistic graphical models. And those are the disciplines within the deep learning. They always try to come up with these probabilistic models to describe the data set. And a lot of people working in that field. All right, so that is the clustering part of this unsupervised learning.